What if the very foundation a church was built on, the core beliefs that started it all, were just quietly swapped out over time? Today, we're going to dig deep into the original theology of the Seventh-day Adventist pioneers. And what we uncover is a pretty dramatic shift in doctrine, one that really reshaped the church's entire identity from the ground up.
So, to really get a grip on this, we have to go all the way back to the beginning. What did the Adventist founders actually believe about God? When you look at their own words, it reveals a perspective that might just shock you, and it absolutely sets the stage for a major theological conflict down the road. When you start digging into the writings of the church's pioneers, one thing becomes crystal clear pretty fast. On the subject of God, they spoke with a surprisingly unified voice. There wasn't a lot of debate among them on this particular topic. Okay, let's start with James White, one of the key founders. He definitely doesn't mince words here, calling the Trinity inexplicable. But look really close at what else he says. He also rejects anything that makes Christ inferior. So right from the get-go, they were drawing a clear line in the sand. They were against the Trinity, but they were fiercely for the full divinity of Christ. And look, this wasn't just James White's opinion. Joseph Bates, another giant figure in the movement, put it even more bluntly. For him, the idea that the Son and the Father were the same being wasn't just incorrect, it was an impossibility. Their entire belief system rested on a very real, distinct relationship between a father and a son. Then you've got J. N. Andrews, who kind of doubles down on this. He argues that the Trinity doctrine isn't just illogical, he says it actually destroys the personality of God and his Son. And notice how he traces it back to the Council of Nicaea. He's framing it not as a biblical truth, but as a much later man-made tradition. So you're probably asking, if Christ wasn't part of a Trinity, how did they see him as divine? Well, this was their core distinction. Christ wasn't created like an angel, he was begotten. It's like a ray of light from the sun. It's not a separate creation, it comes directly from the Son's own substance. For them, this was the key to affirming his full divinity as the literal Son of God. Now, you could imagine taking a stance like this didn't go unnoticed. It led to accusations. Even today, you'll hear the claim that by rejecting the Trinity, the pioneers were denying Christ's divinity. But what's so fascinating is that they faced this exact same charge back in their own time. And let me tell you, their response was anything but quiet. This is really the heart of the whole misunderstanding, right? On one side, you have the modern claim that the pioneers downplayed Jesus. On the other, you have the pioneers' own passionate, fiery rebuttal. For them, it wasn't a denial at all. They believed their view was the only way to truly honor Christ's unique position as the Son of God. And here's James White himself responding directly to the accusation. And look at his emphasis. He put it in all caps. We do not deny the divinity of Christ. He's practically shouting it from the rooftops. He says they delight in exalting the Son. For these guys, there was absolutely zero contradiction. J.H. Wagner breaks down their logic even more clearly here. He's saying, look, our critics are making a huge mistake. They think that rejecting the Trinity automatically means rejecting that Jesus is divine. He says if that were actually true, they'd be the biggest defenders of the Trinity you'd ever seen. But it's not. Their stance was simple. The doctrine just wasn't necessary. So what box did they fit into? What did they call themselves? Well, in 1878, when the church was put on the spot and asked if they were Trinitarian or Unitarian, the answer was just incredible. Neither. They completely refused both labels. They were charting their own course, a third way, affirming that Christ was a divine being in his very person. And yet, despite this incredibly strong, unified foundation, something changed, something big. Over time, the church began to drift away from this original theology, and eventually, it embraced the very doctrine its founders had unanimously and forcefully rejected. Just look at this timeline. It really puts the whole thing in perspective. You've got decades, almost half a century, where the pioneers are all on the same page. They're non-Trinitarian, pointing back to the Council of Nicaea as the source of the error. Then, boom, the 20th century hits, and the church does a complete 180, formally adopting the Trinity as a core belief. And this is so crucial for understanding their mindset. For pioneers like James White, adopting the Trinity wasn't progress. They saw themselves as finishing the job of the Protestant Reformation. To them, the Trinity was a vestige of papacy, an unbiblical error that other reformers had just failed to shake off. So for them, embracing it wasn't moving forward into new light. It was stepping backward into old traditions.
So their rejection wasn't just some theological quibble, it was rooted in a very specific view of history. They were arguing that the Trinity wasn't biblical at all. Instead, they traced it back to the Catholic Church, claimed it had pagan roots, and saw it as a counterfeit doctrine, putting it in the same category as Sunday worship. It was part of a system they felt called to leave behind.
So, where does all of this leave the church? I mean, this isn't a minor doctrinal tweak. This is a seismic shift that forces a really stark conclusion and raises a profound and maybe uncomfortable question about the very identity of the Seventh-day Adventist movement.
A modern Adventist author, Jerry Moon, lays it out in the starkest terms possible. There's no wiggle room here. He says it's one or the other. Either the pioneers were wrong, or the present church has apostatized from biblical truth. It's a binary choice with no middle ground. And this leads to this fascinating, almost ironic twist. You know that word offshoot? It's often used to criticize those who still hold to the original pioneer faith. But if you think about it, if an offshoot is a group that teaches something different than what the founders taught, well, then who is the real offshoot here? The argument is that by adopting the Trinity, it's the mainstream church that actually departed from the foundation.
And really, this all boils down to a conflict of purpose. Was this shift towards Trinitarianism a move to gain popularity, to get a seat at the table with mainstream Christianity, what the pioneers bluntly called Babylon? Or was the original call to be faithful to the Bible no matter what, even if it meant standing alone? For the founders, that choice was clear. And that leaves us with the central question, the one you have to think about. Was this massive doctrinal shift a sign of progress, a church evolving and growing with new light? Or was it a departure from a founding truth, a loss of identity in exchange for mainstream acceptance? That is the question at the very heart of this foundational shift.